The energy beam scorched the air, carrying the unmistakable ozone stench of a high-yield plasma discharge. Kalen didn't think. He just moved. He slammed into the disguised operative, driving them both hard into the polished marble of the resonance citadel. The shot went wide, shattering a crystalline pillar directly above the Empress. Then, the real screaming began. Before the smoke even clears, you know a coup has begun. If you want to see how this human survives the fallout, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. The air in his lungs had tasted a lot sweeter 48 hours ago, right before he ripped his own atmospheric rebreather apart on a dying Xylari courier vessel. The Obsidian Dawn sensors had picked up the decaying distress signal on the jagged edge of the quadrant. Commander Thorne had given the nod. Unofficial, unsanctioned, and highly illegal. They had exactly 12 minutes before rival military cruisers collapsed on the coordinates to pick the bones clean. Kalen breached the twisted hull of the transport. The gravity plating was offline. Sparks spat from exposed wiring, illuminating floating debris and the frozen bodies of the crew. In the center of the carnage, a single stasis pod flickered. Princess Alinx. Her life support was failing, the biometric readout flashing a steady, fatal red, which meant the brass was going to court-martial him. He unlatched his personal rebreather core, his fingers working blindly in the freezing vacuum, and jury-rigged it to her suit. His own lungs began to burn immediately. The extraction team dragged them both out just as the vessel's primary reactor imploded, painting the void in silent fire. Alive. They had saved her. But Kalen quickly learned that survival on Xylos Prime came with conditions. Empress Vora hadn't just thanked him. She had summoned him to the glittering heart of her empire, placing the heavy, iridescent lumina prism around his neck. It was a beautiful artifact. It was also a chain. The life-debt law was ancient, absolute, and inescapable. He had traded his breath for the princesses, so his life now belonged to the throne. A gilded cage, locked tight. How long would you last in a paradise that wouldn't let you leave? Beneath the towering spires of the training grounds, the citadel's triple suns beat down relentlessly. Kalen spent his days pacing the ornate halls, watching the royal guards. He noticed things they didn't. The slight hesitation in a sentry's step. The way the plaza security formations left blind spots near the eastern gates. He was a soldier stripped of his war, repurposed as a ceremonial pet. The cold of the void still haunted his joints, but the suffocating luxury of the palace was worse. The planetary festival arrived with a deafening roar of color and sound. Millions of Xylari citizens crowded the avenues below the resonance citadel. Empress Vora stood at the apex of the balcony, the princess at her side. Kalen stood exactly 3 paces behind them, the lumina prism heavy against his collarbone. That was when he saw it. A shift in the crowd. 3 guards moving out of sync. A hooded figure slipping through a blind spot that shouldn't have been there. The operative raised a concealed cylinder. The operative's cylinder locked onto the royal dais, which meant the ceremonial guard was entirely useless. Kalen didn't think. He just moved, slamming into the disguised assassin as that initial plasma discharge shattered the crystalline pillar above. The marble floor became a slaughterhouse. Kalen broke the assassin's wrist with a brutal twist, kicking the weapon away before the man could recover. But the single shot had never been an assassination attempt. It was a signal. Explosions ripped through the eastern gates. The concussive wave threw Kalen against the dais steps, his ears ringing from the sheer atmospheric pressure. Smoke poured into the plaza, thick and smelling violently of burnt copper and shattered masonry. Rebel factions flooded through the breached walls, firing military-grade disruptors into the panicked civilian crowd. The ceremonial royal guards fell in seconds, their ornamental armor melting instantly under the heavy barrage. This was a highly coordinated, multi-front palace coup, designed meticulously to decapitate the entire empire in a single, overwhelming stroke. Panic. Form a tight perimeter. Kalen roared, hauling a stunned guard captain to his feet by the breastplate. Shields interlocked. Cover the flanks and protect the Empress. The Xylari guards hesitated. Their ancient doctrine dictated rigid, singular combat, prioritizing honorable duels over collective defense. Kalen didn't have time for cultural sensitivity. He shoved the captain into position and snatched a fallen rebel's rifle from the blood-slicked stone. He was a prisoner here, an alien bound by a barbaric life debt, but the Terran military had forged him in the harsh reality of absolute survival. Protocol and borders meant nothing when people were dying. They held the line. For 20 agonizing minutes, Kalen directed the surviving guards. He barked orders, forcing them to adapt to Terran infantry tactics, covering blind spots and overlapping their fire. The rebels surged forward in disciplined waves. Energy bolts scorched Kalen's shoulder. His vision blurred from a glancing blow to the temple. Yet he kept firing, his voice growing hoarse over the deafening roar of the siege. He wasn't fighting for a government. He was fighting for the people behind him. Finally, the heavy mechanical thud of military reinforcements echoed across the plaza. Heavily armored loyalist dreadnoughts breached the hall, their cannons spinning up. The remaining rebels dropped their weapons. Silence reclaimed the ruined citadel. Empress Vora descended the cracked marble steps. Her gaze swept over the bodies, then settled on Kalen. He stood leaning heavily on the alien rifle, bleeding onto her pristine floors. The surviving guards were instinctively watching him for their next order. She reached out with trembling, clawed fingers and unlatched the heavy clasp at his throat. The life debt was balanced. The cage was open. He went back to Terra. The Terran coalition offered him a permanent officer's commission within hours of his return. Kalen looked at the crisp, restrictive uniform laid out on the sterile metal desk. He declined. He drafted a completely different document instead, a bilateral contract demanding independent operational authority. 6 weeks later, he sat at a neutral negotiation table in the deep black. The Lumina prism rested on the polished wood between the Terran diplomats and the Xylari envoy. It was no longer a heavy chain dragging him down. It was a bridge, catching the harsh station lights, gleaming with hard-won authority. If you were given the keys to an empire, would you walk away to build a bridge instead? Tell us what you would choose.